In this tutorial, I'm going to show you something a little bit different than normal, as I'll be painting this model entirely without an airbrush. I recently moved and my airbrush setup is still packed away, so let's see if we can get an interesting looking model with minimal fuss using fairly basic techniques. To start with, I sponge on a fairly general layer of scale 75 petroleum gray over a black undercoat. My plan for this model is to build up my highlights by sponging on a couple of layers of brown gray paints, as I think that the grays tinted with brown just looks more interesting than pure gray. I also decided to use sponging for this model, as I think it adds some really nice volumetric highlights, along with some textures that are fitting for the grim dark aesthetic of the 31st millennium perfectly. While I'm showing how to paint black in this tutorial, the exact same techniques shown here can be used for any other chapter you want to paint. Just swap out the blacks and grays for the color of your choice. Next up, I sponge on another layer of brown gray. This time I try to be a little more targeted in my sponging and hit the areas that the light would fall most intensely on the model. If you're used to my other airbrushing videos, this highlight pattern follows the same placement of where I normally airbrush on my middle highlights or midtones. After I'm happy here, I move on to one more layer of a much more targeted sponged on rainy gray. This is tabbed on very lightly and only on the highest points of the model that I want to be the most highlighted. As you can see here, I use tweezers at this step to hold the sponge. This helps me get it into a finer point and only apply the sponging effect to the exact areas I want it to go. The model is looking pretty good at this step, and the texture of the sponged on paint really gives the model a beat up and worn appearance. But it reads a bit gray to me at this point, and I wanted to blend the voluminous layers a bit more, so I turned to glazing with a black ink. To start with, I mix up some black ink with water on my dry palette until it gets to a dirty water consistency, and then I just apply this over the entire model. In effect here, my goal is to tint the model slightly black and smooth out all the various tones. You do want to make sure here, however, they don't flood your model with this mixture, as that will leave tide marks or coffee stains, as you might have seen previously when using Games Workshop shades. Instead, I gently tap my brush to a paper towel to wick away the majority of the moisture, and then apply a thin, very transparent coat over the entire model. It might even appear here that you're not doing much other than getting the model wet, but I promise you that you are tinting your model just a little bit blacker with each pass. Eventually, after 2 or 3 passes, the entire model will be tinted a little bit darker, and the model should read more black than gray. Also, this step evens out all the various colors we put on the model before and blends them together just a little bit nicer, so they appear as one unified color on the model when viewed from a distance, as opposed to dispersed chunks and chips of color. I next go in and gently apply some slight scratches and dings with a small brush over the highest points of my armor, just add a little more texture and really push the beat up appearance I'm going for. I also do a light edge stipple / highlight around some of the lower parts of the Marine's armor and around the faceplate grills, just to add a little more contrast to the model, make it more visually interesting. In addition to this texture, I do one more very light sponge highlight of rainy gray, just to add a few more dots of color to the highest points of the Marine's armor to provide that final pop of color at the highest highlights. For the last step of the black armor, I go back to my black glaze and apply it to targeted glazes from my midtones down into my shadows. The objective here is to further blend these midtones into the pure black of the shadow, and to also boost the intensity of the blackest shadows. If you are not familiar with glazing in this way, you still want to make sure that you wick off most of the glaze in your brush so you don't end up leaving tide marks. And you also want to make sure that you brush towards your shadows as opposed to away from them. This is because your brush actually leaves more paint at the end of its stroke than the beginning, so by brushing towards the shadows, you are forcing in a slight gradient, because the more paint that's left behind, the more will show up. This last glazing stage can go for as long as you like, and I think I do 3 or 4 passes over most of the model with it. Really, there is no right or wrong way to do this though, and I would recommend that you just give this technique a try and stop when you're happy with how the model is looking. The one last thing I'll say on this though is that you absolutely want to let each layer dry before you move on to the next one, as otherwise you run the risk of tearing your layer and leaving behind a nasty brush stroke or jagged lines where you removed a partially cured paint layer. I finish off the armor by brushing on a layer of AK Interactive Ultra Matte Varnish. This step is completely optional, but because I'm going to be applying decals on this model later on, and I always seal my models with varnish of some sort, I want to make sure I finish the armor that's not decaled with the same varnish I use for the decals, which again in this case is AK Interactive Ultra Matte Varnish. So I actually lied a little bit before, once I was done with my armor, as there was one more step I kind of forgot about until I got to editing, and that is a light sponge strip of heavy metal over the entire Marine's armor, just to define the edges a little more and add some more contrast and texture. Moving on to the silver metallic parts, I want to do something a little more interesting than simply doing a silver base coat and covering it with Nuln oil. So instead, I applied a silver base coat of heavy metal, slapped on a layer of Athonian Camoshade, and then applied a layer of Nuln oil. There are a few other steps after this, but I wanted to take a moment here to deep dive into my choices and why I did what I did. First of all, I decided to do a layer of the Camoshade because I wanted to get a little bit of color into my metal, and I thought the green in the Camoshade would add a nice nod to the future Dark Angel's color scheme. In general though, I don't think you can go wrong with adding more colors to your metallics, as it makes them far more interesting and eye-catching. The other thing that I recommend here is that you do not use the gloss version of Nuln oil, as the matte nature of the normal shades is a good thing. This is because I'm using the shade to create shadows, and well, by their nature, shadows reflect less light and are thus matte. I will push the shininess back in with future highlights, but I want the contrast of my metals to not just be in the colors, but the actual finish as well. Thus, the matte in the shadows and the glossy, shiny, reflective pieces at the highlights. After the shades have fully dried, I do a rough overbrush with heavy metal. This is kind of like a mixture between dry brushing and edge highlighting, where I try to quickly but roughly highlight the metal to brighten it up. The goal here is to also leave the shade only in the recesses of the model, which will dial down the green tint we applied before as well. Finally, I do a very targeted edge highlight of speed metal to further bring up the luster of the metallics and to add a little more contrast to the highest points. This video is already running a bit longer than I normally like to do, so I'm going to skip over the next few steps. One thing I wanted to point out here is how important it is to draw your viewer's eyes up towards the head of the model. For example, right here, if you look at this model as it stands right now, the red bolt gun really draws your attention right to the center of the model, and your eyes kind of bounce off the head and don't really see it. It blends right into the rest of the model. This is why I decided to repaint the eyes from a metallic glazed with a camber crimson to my traditional glowing eye scheme, as it draws the attention back towards the face of the model where it belongs. If you're curious how I did these eyes, there's going to be a link in the top right hand corner of this video for you to check out. For the last step of weathering, I simply mix up a little bit of weathering powder with water on my palette and apply this to all the cracks and crevices of the model. Not only does this give the Marine a further grungy appearance, it also adds one more pop of color to the black armor, which makes the model, again, more visually interesting. Huge shout out to Brian Scott92 over on Instagram for this technique, and if you haven't seen his work before, I'd highly recommend taking a look at it. He's currently doing some awesome world eaters that are mind-blowingly good. Finally, I apply the decals to the model doing a normal step of gloss varnish base coat, applying the decal, applying a layer of microsol, and then matte varnishing it off. But I also do some sponge chipping of black over top of them to give them a worn and beat up appearance too. I'm not going to get into a ton of detail here on how I did the checkered decals over the vambrace. It's a little bit of an involved process, and I'm planning to do a further video on that. So if you want to see that, make sure you hit the subscribe button to get notifications when I do put it out. So that's pretty much it for this model. As I said before, this is the first one I've done in a long time that has no airbrushing involved at all. So let me know in the comments below if you like this kind of tutorial and want to see more non-airbrushed ones, or should I go back to airbrushing as soon as I get my setup back up and running. I've also started getting some pictures recently of viewers' models that have been based or inspired by my schemes in my videos, which I'd love to see. It's always great knowing that what I'm doing is inspiring some of y'all out there. So if you have any pictures you want to send me that I can feature on this channel as well, please reach out either to my email address or my Instagram account, which are linked below in the description. As always, thanks for watching, and keep doing stuff.